The sound of hoofbeats thundered behind Abigail Montgomery as she urged her chestnut mare forward, her heart pounding with each stride. The early morning sun of 1876 was just beginning to peek over the distant mountains of Wyoming Territory, casting long shadows across the prairie grass as she fled the only home she had ever known. "Get back here, girl." Her father's voice boomed behind her, slurred with whiskey even at this early hour. "You ain't leaving this family, not after everything I've done for you." Tears streamed down Abigail's face as she pressed forward, the wind whipping her copper hair from beneath her bonnet. At 20 years old, she had endured her father's drunken rages for far too long. The bruise blooming on her cheek was the final straw, the evidence of his fury when he discovered her small cache of saved coins money that represented her dream of independence, of escape. "I'd rather die than go back," she whispered fiercely to herself, leaning lower over her horse's neck. Behind her, the thundering grew louder. Her father was gaining on her, his sturdy stallion more powerful than her mare. Terror clawed at her throat as she realized she couldn't outrun him, not all the way to Whispering Creek, the nearest town still 10 miles distant. Suddenly, from the rolling hills to her right, another horse appeared, a magnificent black stallion ridden by a tall figure. The rider cut across the prairie at a diagonal, dust kicking up behind powerful hooves as he intercepted her path. Abigail pulled back on the reins, momentarily terrified that this stranger meant to block her escape, to deliver her back to her father's cruel hands. But as the rider drew alongside, she saw a pair of kind blue eyes beneath the brim of a weathered Stetson. "Looks like you could use some assistance, miss," the cowboy said, his voice deep and steady. He glanced over his shoulder at her pursuer, his jaw tightening. "That man giving you trouble?" "My father," Abigail gasped, struggling to catch her breath. "Please, I can't go back." The cowboy nodded once, understanding in his eyes. "Name's Patrick Callahan. Let's get you to town." Without another word, he guided his horse alongside hers, placing himself between Abigail and her approaching father. "This ain't your business, stranger," shouted Jacob Montgomery as he closed the distance, his face red with exertion and rage. "That's my daughter, and she's coming home." Patrick straightened in his saddle, his hand casually moving to rest on the revolver at his hip. "The lady doesn't seem to share your plans, sir. She's my flesh and blood. I decide where she goes." "Not anymore," Patrick replied, his voice calm but firm. "Miss, are you heading to Whispering Creek?" Abigail nodded, too frightened to speak as her father's horse pranced nervously just yards away. "Then that's where we're going," Patrick announced. "Sir, I suggest you turn around and head home. Sleep off whatever's got you in such a state." Jacob's hand moved toward his own gun, but Patrick was faster, drawing his revolver in one fluid motion without aiming it directly at the older man. "I wouldn't," Patrick warned. "No need for bloodshed today. Just let your daughter be." For a tense moment, the three of them remained frozen in a tableau of dust and morning light. Then Jacob spat on the ground and yanked his horse around. "You'll regret this, Abigail," he shouted over his shoulder. "Don't bother coming back when this fool leaves you high and dry." Only when her father was a distant figure on the horizon did Abigail let out the breath she'd been holding. Her hands trembled on the reins. "Thank you," she whispered, finally looking properly at her rescuer. Patrick Callahan was perhaps 30, with a face weathered by sun and wind. His beard was neatly trimmed, framing a mouth that seemed more accustomed to smiling than frowning, though it was serious now. He wore simple cowboy attire, denim pants, a faded blue shirt, and a leather vest, all showing signs of hard work and the dusty trail. "No need for thanks," he said, holstering his weapon. "No man should chase a woman like that, kin or not." He studied her face, his expression darkening when he noticed the bruise. "Seems you had good reason to leave." Abigail touched her cheek self-consciously. "It was time," she said simply. Patrick nodded, understanding in his eyes. "We should keep moving. Town's a fair piece away, and I'd feel better putting more distance between us and your father." As they rode side by side, Abigail felt the adrenaline of her escape begin to fade, replaced by the sobering reality of her situation. She had left with only the clothes on her back, a small bundle of possessions tied to her saddle, and the meager savings her father hadn't discovered. Freedom came at a price, and she wasn't sure how she would manage once she reached Whispering Creek. "May I ask where you're headed after town, Mr. Callahan?" she asked, breaking the silence between them. "Patrick, please," he corrected with a small smile. "I've got a small cattle operation about 30 miles west of Whispering Creek, just coming back from delivering a herd to the railroad." "You're a rancher then?" "Started that way. Worked as a hired hand since I was 16, saved every penny until I could buy my own spread 5 years back. Nothing fancy, but it's mine." Pride colored his voice. "And you, Miss?" "Montgomery, Abigail Montgomery," she replied. "As for where I'm going—" She trailed off, the uncertainty of her future suddenly overwhelming. Patrick seemed to sense her distress. "One step at a time, Miss Montgomery. First, we get to town. You get a hot meal and a safe place to rest. Tomorrow will sort itself out." His quiet confidence soothed her frayed nerves. For the first time since she'd made the decision to flee, Abigail felt that perhaps everything would indeed be all right. The prairie stretched before them, the tall grass waving in the morning breeze. In the distance, a herd of pronghorn antelope grazed peacefully, lifting their heads to watch the riders pass before returning to their meal. The vastness of the Wyoming landscape made Abigail feel small, but also strangely free. "Have you lived in these parts long?" Patrick asked, breaking the contemplative silence. "All my life," Abigail answered. "My father brought us west when I was just a baby. My mother died of fever when I was 12, and it's been just the two of us since then." She didn't add how her father had changed after her mother's death, how the grief had twisted him, making him seek solace in whiskey bottles rather than in his daughter's companionship. "I'm sorry about your mother," Patrick said, genuine sympathy in his voice. "Losing a parent is never easy." "Were you born out west?" Abigail asked, eager to shift the conversation away from her painful past. Patrick shook his head. "Born in Boston. My father was a shipbuilder, but I always felt drawn to open spaces, to a life less confined by brick and stone. When I was 16, I hopped a train west and never looked back." "Didn't your family miss you?" A shadow passed over Patrick's face. "My mother died when I was young, like yours. My father remarried a woman who made it clear I wasn't welcome. When I left, I doubt anyone shed many tears." Abigail felt a kinship with this man who understood loss and the need to forge one's own path. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats and the occasional call of a meadowlark, the only sounds breaking the prairie quiet. As the sun climbed higher, the heat intensified. Patrick pulled his horse to a stop near a small creek that cut through the grassland. "We should rest the horses and get some water," he suggested, dismounting in one fluid motion. Abigail nodded, suddenly aware of her own thirst. Patrick helped her down from her mare, his hands strong and steady on her waist. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her that had nothing to do with the summer sun. "Thank you," she murmured, quickly stepping away to lead her horse to water. Patrick pulled a small tin cup from his saddlebag and dipped it into the clear stream, offering it to Abigail first. Their fingers brushed as she accepted it, and she found herself studying his hands strong and calloused from ranch work. yet gentle in their movements. "Your father," Patrick began hesitantly as he refilled the cup for himself. "Will he come looking for you in town?" Abigail sighed, sitting on a sun-warmed rock by the creek's edge. "Perhaps. He's always been possessive, more so after Mother died, but he's also proud. Being publicly refused might keep him away, at least for a while. And after that," she shrugged, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. "I don't know. I didn't plan much beyond getting away. I have some money saved, not much, but enough to rent a room for a few weeks while I look for work." Patrick nodded thoughtfully. Whispering Creek's growing. The new railroad spurs bringing in business. You might find something at the hotel or one of the shops. "I can cook, clean, so," Abigail said, eager to prove her usefulness. "And I kept all the accounts for the farm since Mother died. I'm good with numbers." "A woman of many talents," Patrick observed with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Abigail felt her cheeks warm at his praise. It had been so long since anyone had valued her skills or seen her as anything more than an unpaid farmhand and housekeeper. After their brief rest, they continued toward Whispering Creek. The landscape gradually changed as they rode, the endless prairie giving way to more varied terrain with scattered pine groves and rocky outcroppings. The distant mountains seemed to draw closer, their snow-capped peaks gleaming in the midday sun. "There," Patrick said eventually, pointing ahead to where a thin plume of smoke rose above a cluster of buildings nestled in a valley. "Whispering Creek." Abigail felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The town represented safety from her father, but also a leap into the unknown. She straightened her shoulders, determined to face whatever came next with courage. As they approached the outskirts of town, the rutted dirt trail widened into a proper road. They passed a small homestead where a woman hung laundry while children played in the yard. The woman waved at Patrick, who tipped his hat in return. "You're well known here," Abigail observed. "I come through every few weeks for supplies," he explained. "It's a friendly town for the most part. People look out for each other." The main street of Whispering Creek bustled with midday activity. A stagecoach was unloading passengers in front of the hotel. Cowboys lounged outside the saloon, and women in calico dresses moved between the general store and the milliner's shop. The new railroad depot at the far end of town gleamed with fresh paint, a testament to the prosperity it promised to bring. Patrick guided them to a modest two-story building with a sign proclaiming it Widow Parker's boarding house. "Mrs. Parker's a good woman," he told Abigail as they dismounted. "Fair prices, clean rooms, and she doesn't tolerate any nonsense under her roof. You'll be safe here." Abigail nodded gratefully, suddenly overwhelmed by the kindness of this stranger who had risked himself to help her. "I don't know how to thank you properly, Mr. Callahan Patrick. You've done so much for me today." Patrick's expression softened. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Abigail said firmly. "They wouldn't have. Most would have ridden past and called it not their concern." Before he could respond, the door to the boarding house opened, and a plump, gray-haired woman in an apron stepped onto the porch. "Patrick Callahan. Twice in 1 month, to what do I owe the pleasure?" the woman called cheerfully. "Mrs. Parker," Patrick greeted her with a tip of his hat. "I've brought someone who needs a room. This is Miss Abigail Montgomery." Mrs. Parker's sharp eyes took in Abigail's disheveled appearance, the fading bruise on her cheek, and the small bundle of possessions. Her expression softened with understanding. "Well, come in, dear. You look like you could use a hot meal and a rest." She turned to Patrick. "You staying too?" Patrick hesitated. "I should get back to the ranch. My foreman's capable, but we've got calves that need branding." Disappointment flashed through Abigail, surprising her with its intensity. This man was a stranger, yet the thought of him leaving filled her with unease. At least stay for dinner, Mrs. Parker insisted. I've got a beef stew that's been simmering since morning and fresh bread just out of the oven. Patrick glanced at Abigail, and something in her expression must have swayed him. I reckon the ranch can spare me a few more hours, he conceded. Inside, the boarding house was clean and simply furnished, with a parlor to the right of the entrance and a large dining room to the left. Delicious aromas wafted from the kitchen at the back of the house. I've got a nice room available on the second floor, overlooking the garden, Mrs. Parker told Abigail. $2 a week, includes breakfast and dinner. Wash rooms down the hall, and there's hot water for bathing on Wednesdays and Saturdays. That sounds wonderful, Abigail said, reaching for her small coin purse. I can pay for the first week now. After settling the payment, Mrs. Parker showed Abigail to her room. It was small but comfortable, with a narrow bed covered by a colorful patchwork quilt, a washstand with a porcelain basin, and a wooden dresser. The window indeed overlooked a well-tended garden where vegetables and flowers grew in neat rows. Get yourself freshened up, dear Mrs. Parker said kindly. Dinner's in an hour, and don't worry, you're safe here. Left alone, Abigail sank onto the bed, the emotions of the day finally catching up with her. She had done it, she had escaped. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years it was hers to shape. She washed her face and hands in the basin, wincing as she touched the bruise. After combing her hair and changing into her one spare dress, a simple blue cotton that had belonged to her mother, she felt more prepared to face whatever came next. When she descended to the dining room, she found Patrick already seated at the large oak table, along with 3 other boarders, an elderly gentleman who introduced himself as the town's schoolteacher, a young woman who worked at the milliner's shop, and a quiet man who Mrs. Parker whispered was a writer from back east documenting life on the frontier. The meal was everything Mrs. Parker had promised: hearty beef stew, fresh bread with churned butter, and apple pie for dessert. The conversation flowed easily, with the others politely not asking about Abigail's circumstances. Instead, they discussed town news, the progress of the railroad, and the upcoming harvest festival. Throughout the meal, Abigail was acutely aware of Patrick across the table. He spoke little, but when he did, everyone listened. There was a quiet authority about him, a sense that here was a man who knew his own mind and lived by his own code. After dinner, the other boarders retired to their rooms or the parlor, leaving Abigail and Patrick alone in the dining room with their coffee. "Will you be all right here?" Patrick asked, his voice low. Abigail nodded. "Mrs. Parker seems kind, and the town feels possible. Like I could make a life here." "You could," he agreed. "It's a growing place. They're even talking about building a proper school next year." "Do you ever think of living in town?" Abigail asked, curious about this man who had come to her rescue. Patrick shook his head, a small smile playing at his lips. "Too confining. I need space, sky overhead. The ranch suits me." "It must be lonely sometimes," she ventured. "It can be," he admitted. "But there's a difference between being alone and being lonely. Most days I'm just alone." The honesty of his answer touched her. Here was someone who understood solitude but didn't fear it. "I should go," Patrick said eventually, draining his coffee cup. "It'll be dark soon, and I've got a fair ride ahead." Outside, as he prepared to mount his horse, Abigail stood on the boardwalk, uncertain what to say. How did one properly thank a stranger who had changed the course of one's life? "I'm in town most Saturdays for supplies," Patrick said, adjusting his saddle. "Perhaps I'll see you then." "I'd like that," Abigail replied, surprised by how much she meant it. Patrick swung onto his horse with practiced ease. "Take care, Miss Montgomery." "Abigail," she corrected. "Please call me Abigail." He tipped his hat, a smile warming his features. Abigail then, until Saturday. As she watched him ride away, the setting sun casting his silhouette in gold, Abigail felt a curious mixture of gratitude and anticipation. In the space of a day, her life had been upended, yet somehow she felt more grounded than she had in years. Morning came with the cheerful sounds of a town awakening. Roosters crowed, shopkeepers raised their shutters, and the distant whistle of the morning train pierced the air. Abigail opened her eyes to unfamiliar surroundings before remembering where she was in her room at Widow Parker's, free from her father's house at last. After a breakfast of flapjacks and bacon shared with the other boarders, Abigail set out to explore Whispering Creek and, more pressingly, to seek employment. Her savings wouldn't last forever, and she was determined to be self-sufficient. The main street of Whispering Creek stretched for several blocks, lined with a mix of wooden and brick buildings. The town had clearly grown rapidly with the coming of the railroad, with newer structures standing proud beside weather-worn establishments that had served the community since its founding. Abigail's first stop was the general store, a large building with wide windows displaying everything from farm tools to bolts of fabric. A bell tinkled as she entered, and she was greeted by a middle-aged man arranging a display of canned goods. "Good morning, miss," he said cheerfully. "Something I can help you find today. Actually, I was wondering if you might be hiring," Abigail replied, summoning her courage. "I'm new in town and looking for work." The shopkeeper's expression turned apologetic. "Wish I could help, miss, but my wife and daughter handle all we need here." "You might try the hotel, though. Heard they're looking for help with the increase in rail passengers." Abigail thanked him and continued her quest. The hotel was indeed hiring, but only for evening serving in their dining room hours that would leave her walking back to the boarding house alone in the dark, a prospect that made her uneasy. The milliner had no need for additional help. The dressmaker already had an apprentice. The small cafe was family-run. By midday, Abigail's initial optimism had faded considerably, and she found herself sitting on a bench outside the post office, contemplating her dwindling options. "You look like you could use some good news," a friendly voice interrupted her thoughts. Abigail looked up to see a woman perhaps a few years older than herself, dressed in a practical brown skirt and white shirtwaist, with a leather satchel slung over her shoulder. "Is it that obvious?" Abigail asked with a small smile. "I recognize the look of someone who's been job hunting without success," the woman said, sitting beside her. "I'm Amanda Winters, by the way. I run the telegraph office." She extended her hand. "Abigail Montgomery," she replied, shaking Amanda's hand. "I arrived in town yesterday and I'm trying to find work." "What sort of work are you looking for? What skills do you have?" "I can cook, clean, so." Abigail began reciting her usual list, then hesitated. "But what I'm really good at is figures. I kept all the accounts for my father's farm." Amanda's eyes lit up. "Can you read and write well, and your arithmetic is solid?" "Yes to both," Abigail confirmed. "My mother was a school teacher before she married. She made sure I had a proper education." "Well, this might be fortunate timing," Amanda said. "Mr. Hargrove at the bank mentioned just yesterday that he needs someone to help with the ledgers. The railroads brought so much new business that he's falling behind on his bookkeeping." Hope fluttered in Abigail's chest. "You think he would consider a woman for such a position, Mr. Hargrove's more concerned with accuracy than propriety," Amanda replied with a wink. "Come on, I'll introduce you." The bank was a solid brick building at the corner of Main Street and Railroad Avenue. Inside, the high ceiling and polished wooden counters gave an impression of stability and wealth. Amanda led Abigail past the teller windows to a door marked "Edward Hargrove, Manager." After a brief knock, they were admitted to a cluttered office where a harried-looking man with spectacles perched on his nose was surrounded by stacks of ledgers and papers. "Mr. Hargrove, I've brought someone who might be able to help with your bookkeeping situation," Amanda announced. The banker looked up, his expression skeptical as he took in Abigail. "Miss Winters, I appreciate the thought, but I need someone with a head for numbers, not—" Miss Montgomery kept the accounts for her family's farm, Amanda interrupted smoothly. "She's educated and comes highly recommended." Abigail shot Amanda a grateful look for the slight embellishment. Mr. Hargrove removed his spectacles, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Is that so? Well, I suppose I could test your abilities." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Thank you, Miss Winters. I'll take it from here." Amanda squeezed Abigail's shoulder encouragingly before departing, leaving her to face Mr. Hargrove's scrutiny. The next hour was a blur of numbers and questions as the banker tested Abigail's arithmetic skills, her understanding of debits and credits, and her ability to reconcile accounts. By the end, even Mr. Hargrove seemed impressed. "Well, Miss Montgomery, your skills are indeed as advertised," he admitted, leaning back in his chair. "I can offer you a position as my assistant bookkeeper, 6 days a week, 8 until 5 with Sundays off. The pay is $30 a month." It was less than a male clerk would receive, Abigail knew, but more than she could hope for in most other positions available to women. "I accept, Mr. Hargrove. When would you like me to start?" "Tomorrow morning would not be too soon," he replied with feeling, glancing at the stacks of work surrounding him. "The railroad has been a blessing for business but a curse for my ledgers." As Abigail left the bank, she could hardly believe her good fortune. A respectable position with decent pay, doing work she enjoyed and was good at it was more than she had dared hope for on her first full day in Whispering Creek. The rest of the week passed in a whirlwind of new experiences. Abigail quickly proved her worth at the bank, bringing order to Mr. Hargrove's chaotic bookkeeping system. She became acquainted with her fellow boarders at Widow Parker's and began to feel a part of the small community there. Amanda from the telegraph office became a friend, introducing her to other young women in town. Throughout it all, Abigail found her thoughts frequently turning to Patrick Callahan. She told herself it was natural to think of the man who had rescued her, who had shown her kindness when she most needed it. Yet she knew there was more to it, something about his quiet strength and gentle eyes that had touched something deep within her. When Saturday arrived, Abigail took extra care with her appearance. She washed her copper hair until it shone, arranged it in a simpler style than the severe bun she wore for work, and chose her blue dress again, freshly pressed by Mrs. Parker's capable hands. "My, don't you look pretty today," Mrs. Parker commented at breakfast. "Any special reason?" Abigail felt her cheeks warm. "Just enjoying my day off," she replied, not quite meeting the older woman's knowing gaze. After breakfast, Abigail strolled down Main Street, ostensibly to browse the shops now that she had a steady income, but her eyes constantly scanned the street for a familiar figure on a black stallion. It was nearly noon when she spotted him, riding into town from the west. Her heart quickened as she watched him dismount in front of the general store, tying his horse to the hitching post with practiced ease. He hadn't seen her yet, and for a moment, Abigail simply observed him the confident way he moved, the nod of greeting he gave to passers-by, the sun glinting off his light brown hair when he removed his hat upon entering the store. Taking a deep breath, Abigail crossed the street and approached the general store. Through the window, she could see Patrick discussing something with the shopkeeper, a list in his hand. She waited outside, suddenly unsure. What if he had merely been polite about seeing her again? What if he had forgotten her entirely? Before she could talk herself into leaving, Patrick emerged from the store, nearly colliding with her. "Abigail," he exclaimed, genuine pleasure lighting his features. "I was hoping I'd see you today." Relief washed through her. "I was hoping the same," she admitted. "How have you settled in? Found work yet?" he asked, stepping aside as a couple passed on the boardwalk. Abigail nodded eagerly. "At the bank, if you can believe it. Mr. Hargrove hired me to help with the bookkeeping." "That's wonderful," Patrick said, his smile warming his blue eyes. "You mentioned you were good with numbers. Seems Mr. Hargrove recognized talent when he saw it." His praise sent a flutter through Abigail's chest. "I have Amanda Winters to thank for the introduction, and you, of course. Without your help, I'd never have made it to town." Patrick waved off her thanks. "I have a few more errands to run," he said. "Would you? That is, might you consider joining me for lunch after? The hotel dining room serves a decent meal." "I'd like that very much," Abigail replied, unable to keep the smile from her face. They agreed to meet in an hour, giving Patrick time to complete his shopping. Abigail used the time to post a letter to her childhood friend in a neighboring town, letting her know where she had settled. She carefully avoided including any details that might help her father locate her, though she had seen no sign of him in town all week. The hotel dining room was busy with the Saturday lunch crowd, but they secured a small table near the window. Patrick pulled out Abigail's chair for her, a gesture that reminded her that beneath his rugged exterior was a gentleman. Over a meal of roast chicken and vegetables, they talked easily, learning more about each other. Patrick told her about his ranch, 500 acres with a small herd of cattle, a few horses he bred and trained, and a comfortable if modest house he had built with his own hands. "It's nothing fancy," he said, a hint of self-consciousness in his voice. "But there's good water year-round from the creek, and the valley offers protection from the worst winter storms." "It sounds wonderful," Abigail said sincerely. The way he described it made her envision a peaceful haven, so different from the tension-filled farmhouse of her childhood. "And what about you?" Patrick asked. "Has your father made any attempt to find you?" Abigail shook her head. "No, and I'm grateful for it. Perhaps he's realized I'm better off away from him." She didn't truly believe this. Her father was not one to surrender easily, but she wanted to believe the danger had passed. "I've been asking around town," Patrick admitted, "making sure people know to be on the lookout for a man asking about you. Sheriff Wilson's a good man. He'll keep an eye out." Touched by his concern, Abigail impulsively reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Thank you for looking out for me, even after you brought me to town." Patrick turned his hand to clasp hers briefly before they both withdrew. "I'd like to think someone would do the same for my sister, if I had one." "Is that how he sees me?" Abigail wondered, feeling a curious disappointment at the thought. She was saved from dwelling on it by the arrival of apple pie for dessert. After lunch, they walked along Main Street together, stopping occasionally to allow Patrick to complete his errands. Abigail found herself acutely aware of his presence beside her, the slight brush of his arm against hers in the crowded Mercantile, the way he placed a protective hand at the small of her back when they crossed the street, the clean scent of soap and leather that surrounded him. All too soon, it was time for Patrick to return to his ranch before dark. "Will you be in town next Saturday?" Abigail asked as they stood beside his horse. "I will," he confirmed, adjusting his saddlebags. "Perhaps we could have lunch again." "I'd like that," she said, trying to contain her eagerness. Patrick mounted his horse, looking down at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Take care of yourself, Abigail Montgomery." "You too, Patrick Callahan." As she watched him ride away, Abigail acknowledged to herself what she had been trying to deny all day. She was developing feelings for this kind, quiet cowboy who had ridden to her rescue. Whether anything would come of those feelings remained to be seen, but for the first time in years, Abigail allowed herself to hope. The following weeks fell into a pleasant rhythm. Abigail's work at the bank continued to impress Mr. Hargrove, who gradually entrusted her with more responsibilities. She made friends in town, particularly with Amanda and with Sarah, the young woman who worked at the milliner's shop and also boarded at Widow Parker's. On Sundays, she attended services at the small white church in the center of town, finding comfort in the familiar rituals and the sense of community. And every Saturday, Patrick would come to town for supplies, and they would share lunch at the hotel. Sometimes they would walk afterward, exploring the growing town together. Other times, when Patrick had many errands, Abigail would accompany him, enjoying the simple pleasure of his company as he selected supplies for his ranch. With each meeting, Abigail found herself more drawn to him. She learned that beneath his reserved exterior was a man of strong principles, dry humor, and unexpected gentleness. He spoke little of himself, but when he did, she treasured each revelation: how he had worked for 3 different ranches before saving enough to buy his own land, how he had once broken his leg trying to rescue a calf from a ravine during a thunderstorm, how he read poetry by lamplight on long winter evenings. In turn, she shared parts of herself she had kept hidden for years: her love of drawing, abandoned when her father deemed it a waste of time, her dream of perhaps one day teaching as her mother had, her fear that she had inherited her father's quick temper, though she fought to control it. Patrick listened to her dreams and fears with equal attention, never dismissing or judging. Sometimes, when their conversations ventured into personal territory, Abigail would catch him looking at her with an intensity that made her heart race, but he never overstepped the bounds of propriety. It was during their 5th Saturday lunch when everything changed. They had just finished their meal and were discussing the upcoming harvest festival when Patrick suddenly fell silent, his eyes fixed on something over Abigail's shoulder. The color drained from his face. "Patrick, what's wrong?" Abigail asked, alarmed by his expression. "Don't turn around," he said quietly. "Your father just walked into the dining room." Fear gripped Abigail's heart like an icy hand. "Are you certain?" Red hair going gray, tall, with a scar above his right eye. "Yes, I'm certain." Abigail nodded, her hands beginning to tremble. The description matched her father perfectly. "What do we do?" Patrick's expression hardened with resolve. "We leave calmly. There's a side door near the kitchen. I know the owner, he'll let us through." With a gentle hand on her elbow, Patrick guided Abigail from her chair, positioning himself to block her from view as they moved toward the back of the dining room. They had almost reached the door to the kitchen when a shout froze them in place. "Abigail, girl, stop right there." Slowly, Abigail turned to face her father. Jacob Montgomery stood in the center of the dining room, his face flushed with anger or drink, perhaps both. He looked thinner than when she had last seen him, his clothes more disheveled, but the rage in his eyes was all too familiar. "Hello, father," she said, proud that her voice remained steady despite the fear coursing through her. "6 weeks I've been searching for you," Jacob growled, taking a step toward her. 6 weeks of riding from town to town, asking after a red-haired girl who ran away from home. The other diners watched the confrontation with undisguised interest, conversations dying away as all attention focused on the drama unfolding before them. "I didn't run away from home," Abigail said, her voice stronger now. "I left an untenable situation. There's a difference." "Fancy words won't change what you did," Jacob snapped. "You're coming back with me, now." Patrick stepped forward, placing himself partially between Abigail and her father. "Mr. Montgomery, your daughter is a grown woman with a good position here in town. She's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go." Jacob's gaze shifted to Patrick, recognition dawning in his bloodshot eyes. You're the one who interfered that day. Been filling my daughter's head with nonsense, have you? Maybe sharing her bed too." Gasps rippled through the dining room at the crude accusation. Patrick's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "That's enough, Mr. Montgomery," he said firmly. "You're causing a scene in a respectable establishment. I suggest you leave before someone fetches the sheriff." "I'm not leaving without what's mine," Jacob insisted, his hand moving toward the knife at his belt. Before he could draw it, another voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here, folks?" Sheriff Wilson stood in the doorway, his badge gleaming on his chest, one hand resting casually on his holstered revolver. "Sheriff," Patrick acknowledged with relief. "Mr. Montgomery here was just leaving. Weren't you, sir?" Jacob's eyes darted between the sheriff, Patrick, and Abigail, calculation replacing some of the blind rage. "This isn't over," he muttered, before turning on his heel and stalking out of the dining room. The sheriff followed him out, presumably to ensure he left peacefully, while the other diners erupted into excited whispers. Abigail realized she was shaking only when Patrick gently led her to a chair. "Sit," he urged. "Take a deep breath." "He found me," she whispered, the reality of it sinking in. "He'll try again. I know him, he won't give up." Patrick knelt beside her chair, taking her trembling hands in his. "Listen to me, Abigail. He can't force you to go with him. You're an adult with a job and a place in this community. The law is on your side." "The law isn't always around when needed," Abigail replied, thinking of the isolated location of Mrs. Parker's boarding house, of the dark walk home from the bank each evening. Patrick's expression grew serious. "Then perhaps it's time you had more protection than the law can provide." "What do you mean?" Taking a deep breath, Patrick said. "This isn't how I planned to ask, and certainly not where, but circumstances have forced my hand." He squeezed her fingers gently. "Abigail Montgomery, over these past weeks, I've grown to care for you deeply. I believe you feel something for me as well. Would you consider becoming my wife?" Abigail stared at him, stunned by the unexpected proposal. "Your wife? Patrick, you can't be serious. We barely know each other." "I know enough," he said with quiet certainty. "I know you're kind, intelligent, and stronger than you realize. I know I look forward to Saturdays more than any other day of the week because I'll see you. I know that when I ride back to my ranch, the house feels emptier than it ever did before." His words touched something deep within her, a longing she had scarcely acknowledged even to herself. Yet doubt lingered. "I won't have you propose out of pity or obligation," she said firmly. "I won't be a burden you take on because you feel responsible for me." Patrick's blue eyes held her steadily. "This isn't about obligation, Abigail. Yes, the timing is driven by circumstances, but my feelings are genuine. I'm not offering charity, I'm offering partnership. A life built together." Abigail searched his face, finding only sincerity in his expression. Still, the suddenness of it all left her reeling. "I need time to think, Patrick. This is a lot to consider," he nodded, understanding in his eyes as he rose to his feet. "Of course, I didn't mean to overwhelm you." He glanced toward the door where her father had exited. "But I don't think you should stay at the boarding house tonight. Your father might come looking for you there." "Where would I go? The hotel has secure rooms. Or perhaps Amanda would take you in for a night or two until we're sure your father has left town." In the end, Amanda readily agreed to host Abigail, her small apartment above the telegraph office offering both security and companionship. Patrick insisted on escorting them there, checking that the doors and windows were secure before reluctantly taking his leave. "Think about what I said," he told Abigail quietly as he prepared to depart. "Whatever you decide, I'll respect it." Alone with Amanda that evening, Abigail confided the day's events, including Patrick's proposal. He actually proposed right there in the dining room. Amanda asked, eyes wide with amazement. "After your father's interruption." "Not on one knee or anything," Abigail clarified. "But yes, he asked me to marry him." "And what did you say?" "That I needed time to think." Abigail sighed, hugging a cushion to her chest as they sat in Amanda's small parlor. "It's not that I don't care for him. I do more than I thought possible after knowing someone such a short time. But marriage, that's a lifetime commitment." Amanda studied her thoughtfully. "Do you think he proposed only to protect you from your father?" "He says no, that his feelings are genuine. And I believe him. Patrick isn't the type to lie. But the timing." "The timing was forced by circumstances," Amanda agreed. "But that doesn't make the feelings behind it any less real." Abigail nodded slowly. "I just don't want to make a decision out of fear. Running from one man to another isn't true freedom." "No, it isn't," Amanda said. "But there's a difference between running to someone out of fear and choosing someone because they make you feel safe enough to be yourself." She smiled gently. "I've seen you two together these past weeks. The way he looks at you when you're not watching, that's not obligation, Abigail. That's admiration. Perhaps even love." Love. The word hung in the air between them, both thrilling and terrifying in its implications. "I need to be sure," Abigail said finally, "for both our sakes." That night, as she lay on Amanda's spare bed, Abigail's thoughts swirled with memories of the past weeks. Patrick's smile across the lunch table, the gentle pressure of his hand at her back, the way he listened when she spoke as if her words mattered. She thought of his description of his ranch, the home he had built with his own hands, and allowed herself to imagine sharing that home with him. The image came easily, too easily perhaps. Herself preparing meals in his kitchen, reading by the fire on winter evenings, working alongside him to build something that belonged to both of them. It was a vision of partnership, not subservience, so different from what she had observed in her parents' marriage before her mother's death, and worlds away from the life she had led under her father's roof afterward. Morning brought clarity. After breakfast, Abigail asked Amanda to send a telegram to Patrick's ranch, requesting that he meet her at the church at noon. It was Sunday, and the building would be empty between the morning and evening services, offering privacy for the conversation they needed to have. Patrick arrived precisely at noon, looking somewhat travel-worn, as if he had ridden hard to reach town. When he saw Abigail waiting on the church steps, relief washed over his features. "You're all right," he said as he approached. "I've been worried. There's been no sign of your father, but Sheriff Wilson is keeping watch." "I'm fine," Abigail assured him. "Amanda's been a gracious hostess." They entered the empty church together, the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the wooden pews. Abigail led him to a bench near the front, where they sat side by side, a respectful distance between them. "I've been thinking about your proposal," Abigail began, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "And I've been thinking I handled it poorly," Patrick replied. "You deserved better than a hasty proposal in a public dining room with your father's threat still ringing in the air." "Perhaps," Abigail acknowledged with a small smile, "but circumstances rarely allow for perfect timing." Patrick turned slightly to face her more directly. "Before you give me your answer, I want to be clear about something. My offer stands regardless of your father's presence or absence. If you wish to remain in town, to continue your independent life here, I will support that decision and still do everything in my power to ensure your safety." His words touched her deeply. Here was a man offering her a choice, not an ultimatum, respecting her autonomy even as he offered to share his life with hers. "I believe you," she said softly, "and that's why my answer is yes." Patrick's expression shifted from resignation to disbelief, and then to cautious joy. "Yes, you'll marry me?" Abigail nodded, her own smile growing. "Yes, Patrick Callahan, I will marry you, not out of fear or necessity, but because in these weeks of knowing you, I've come to care for you deeply. I believe we could build a good life together." Patrick reached for her hand, holding it gently between both of his. "We will," he promised. "A life of mutual respect and, I hope, growing love." Love. There was that word again, not spoken directly but implied in his earnest gaze, in the tender way he held her hand. "When?" he asked simply. "Soon," Abigail decided. "Not just because of my father, but because it feels right. Perhaps 2 weeks. Time enough for proper preparations, but not so long that we lose our courage." Patrick smiled, a full, unguarded smile that transformed his face. 2 weeks. I'll speak with Reverend Thomas today." As they left the church together, stepping into the bright September sunshine, Abigail felt a sense of rightness settle over her. The future stretched before them, unknown but full of promise. The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of preparations. Abigail continued her work at the bank, explaining to Mr. Hargrove that while she was getting married, she hoped to continue working until she and Patrick decided to start a family. The banker, having come to rely on her skills, readily agreed to this arrangement. Patrick rode back to his ranch to prepare for his bride's arrival, returning to town every few days to assist with wedding arrangements and to court Abigail properly, now that their engagement was official. They took evening walks along the creek that gave the town its name, sharing hopes and plans for their future. "The house isn't fancy," Patrick warned during one such walk. "Just 4 rooms, kitchen, parlor, and 2 bedrooms, but it's solid and warm, and there's room to expand if needed." "It sounds perfect," Abigail assured him. "I've never needed luxury, only safety and peace." As the wedding day approached, Abigail's anxiety about her father's potential return grew. There had been no sign of him since the confrontation at the hotel, but Sheriff Wilson reported that Jacob Montgomery had been seen in a town 20 miles away, drinking heavily and making threats. "He'll likely come back," the sheriff warned Patrick after Sunday services. "Men like that don't give up easily, especially when they've been publicly humiliated." Patrick nodded grimly. "We'll be ready if he does, but the wedding goes forward as planned." The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cool, a perfect early October day. Mrs. Parker had insisted on hosting the small reception at the boarding house, and the women of the church had rallied to prepare food and decorations. Amanda helped Abigail dress in a simple white gown that Sarah from the milliner's shop had worked overtime to create. "You look beautiful," Amanda said, arranging a crown of autumn flowers in Abigail's copper hair. "Patrick won't know what hit him." Abigail smiled at her reflection in the mirror. The bruise that had marked her cheek on her arrival in Whispering Creek had long since faded, and in its place was a healthy glow born of happiness and hope. The church was filled with townspeople when Abigail arrived. Though she and Patrick had been in Whispering Creek only a short time, they had been embraced by the community. Mr. Hargrove from the bank had offered to walk Abigail down the aisle in the absence of family, a gesture that brought tears to her eyes when he suggested it. At the front of the church stood Patrick, more handsome than she had ever seen him, in a new black suit, his hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaven. When he turned and saw her, the look of wonder in his eyes made every doubt, every fear fade away. The ceremony was simple and traditional. They exchanged vows in clear voices that carried to the back of the church, promising to love, honor, and cherish each other until death parted them. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, Patrick's kiss was gentle but held a promise of deeper passion to come. The reception at Widow Parker's was a joyful affair, with music provided by the town's small band, plentiful food, and even dancing in the cleared parlor. Abigail found herself passed from partner to partner, as the men of the town claimed traditional dances with the bride. But her eyes constantly sought Patrick, finding him watching her with a mixture of pride and possessiveness that sent shivers down her spine. It was late afternoon when they finally prepared to depart for Patrick's ranch, their ranch now. Their few belongings were loaded into a wagon Patrick had brought to town, and they were just saying their final goodbyes when a commotion at the gate drew everyone's attention. Jacob Montgomery stood there, swaying slightly, his face contorted with rage. "So you went and did it," he slurred, his gaze fixed on Abigail in her wedding dress. "Married yourself off to the first man who'd have you." Patrick stepped forward, placing himself between his new wife and her father. "Mr. Montgomery, this is neither the time nor the place. Please leave peacefully." "Peacefully?" Jacob spat on the ground. "There's nothing peaceful about a daughter betraying her father, abandoning her responsibilities." His hand moved to his hip where a revolver was holstered. Several of the wedding guests moved forward, including Sheriff Wilson, but Jacob had already drawn his weapon, pointing it unsteadily in Patrick's direction. "You stole what was mine," Jacob accused. "My daughter, my helper, my property." "I was never your property, father," Abigail said, stepping out from behind Patrick despite his attempt to keep her shielded. "I was your daughter, whom you were meant to protect and nurture, not use and abuse." Jacob's hand wavered, the gun's barrel dipping slightly. For a moment, something like shame crossed his features, quickly replaced by hardened anger. "You sound just like your mother, always thinking you're better than me." "Put the gun down, Jacob," Sheriff Wilson said firmly, his own weapon now drawn. "You don't want to add murder to your troubles." For a tense moment, it seemed Jacob might ignore the warning. Then, with a growl of frustration, he lowered the revolver. "She's not worth the bullet," he muttered, turning to leave. But at the gate, he paused, looking back at Abigail with bloodshot eyes. "Don't come crying to me when he tires of you, girl. You've made your choice." As Jacob disappeared down the street, the wedding guests exhaled collectively. Abigail found herself trembling with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline, grateful for Patrick's steady arm around her waist. "I'm sorry," she whispered to him and to their guests. "I never wanted this day to be marred by his presence." "Nothing is marred," Patrick assured her, his voice firm. "He's gone, and we have a life to begin." The sun was setting as they finally departed Whispering Creek, the wagon rolling westward toward Patrick's ranch. Abigail sat beside her new husband on the wagon seat, watching the town recede behind them. Despite the confrontation with her father, a sense of peace settled over her as they journeyed toward their new home. "Are you all right?" Patrick asked after they had traveled in comfortable silence for some time. Abigail considered the question honestly. "Yes," she decided. Seeing him again was difficult but also final in a way, like closing a door on that part of my life. Patrick nodded, understanding in his eyes. Some doors need to be closed firmly before others can truly open. As darkness fell, the stars emerged in the vast Wyoming sky, countless points of light guiding their way home. Patrick pointed out constellations to Abigail, sharing knowledge passed down from an old ranch hand who had once taught him to navigate by the stars. It was fully dark when they crested a small rise and Patrick reined the horses to a stop. "There," he said, pointing ahead. Home. In the valley below, a light glowed warmly from the window of a sturdy cabin, smoke curling from its chimney into the night sky. Around it, Abigail could make out the shapes of outbuildings, corrals, and the darker mass of grazing cattle in nearby pastures. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. Patrick smiled, pleased by her reaction. "My foreman, Thomas, must have lit the lamps and started a fire for our arrival. He and his wife live in a smaller cabin beyond the barn." They continued down the slope, the horses picking up their pace as they sensed the proximity of their stable and feed. As they drew closer, Abigail could see that the cabin was larger than she had first thought, a substantial log structure with a covered porch across the front and flower beds, now dormant for the season, lining the approach. Patrick helped her down from the wagon seat when they arrived, but before she could take a step toward the house, he swept her into his arms. "Tradition," he explained with a smile, carrying her across the threshold into their home. Inside, the cabin was warm and welcoming. A fire crackled in a stone fireplace that dominated one wall of the main room. Simple but sturdy furniture filled the space, a wooden table with 4 chairs, a comfortable-looking sofa and armchair arranged before the fire, shelves lined with books along one wall. Everything was clean and well-maintained, if somewhat sparse in decoration. Patrick set Abigail gently on her feet, suddenly looking uncertain. "I know it's not what you might be used to." "It's perfect," she interrupted, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "Truly, Patrick. It feels like a home." Relief washed over his features. "Let me show you the rest." He led her through a doorway to the kitchen, a good-sized room with a cast-iron stove, a pump at the sink that drew water from a well, and ample cupboards and work surfaces. Another door led to a small pantry stocked with preserved foods for the coming winter. "The bedrooms are through here," Patrick said, a hint of nervousness entering his voice as he guided her back through the main room to a short hallway. The first bedroom was clearly meant as a guest room, with a narrow bed, a small dresser, and a window overlooking the barnyard. The second, at the end of the hall, was larger and obviously Patrick's, now theirs. A wide bed with a handsome quilt dominated the space, accompanied by 2 dressers, a washstand, and a small writing desk beneath the window. "I cleared half the drawers for your things," Patrick said, gesturing to one of the dressers. "And there's room in the wardrobe for your dresses." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Abigail deeply. Here was tangible evidence that Patrick had been preparing not just his house but his life to include her. "Thank you," she said softly, reaching for his hand, "for making space for me." Patrick's fingers tightened around hers. "I've been making space for you since the day we met, Abigail. I just didn't know it was you I was waiting for." The simple honesty of his words broke something open inside her, a last reserve of caution, perhaps, or a final barrier built from years of guarding her heart. Standing there in the bedroom they would share, Abigail rose on tiptoe and kissed her husband with all the emotion she had held in check through the wedding day. Patrick responded immediately, his arms encircling her waist, drawing her closer. What began as a gesture of gratitude quickly deepened into something more urgent, more primal. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily, a new awareness humming between them. "I should bring in our things from the wagon," Patrick said, his voice rougher than usual. "And I should see what's in the kitchen," Abigail replied, equally affected. "We'll need supper." They moved apart reluctantly, each to their appointed task. As Abigail explored the kitchen, discovering a pot of stew keeping warm on the back of the stove, another thoughtful gesture from Thomas's wife, she presumed, she felt a curious mixture of nervousness and anticipation. She was a wife now in name. Soon she would be a wife in truth. By the time Patrick had unloaded their belongings and tended to the horses, Abigail had set the table and served 2 bowls of the rich beef stew, accompanied by bread that had been left wrapped in a cloth to stay fresh. They ate together at their table for the first time, the domesticity of the scene both novel and somehow familiar, as if they had shared hundreds of meals this way instead of their first. Conversation flowed easily between them, touching on practical matters: the ranch's daily routine, the location of various supplies, plans for the coming winter, but avoiding, by mutual unspoken agreement, the intimacy that awaited them. After the meal, they washed the dishes together, a simple task made new by their awareness of each other: the brush of his hand against hers as he passed her a plate to dry, the way she could feel his gaze on her profile as she worked. When the kitchen was tidy, Patrick built up the fire in the main room while Abigail unpacked some of her personal belongings, arranging them in the drawers he had cleared for her. The ordinary actions helped calm her nerves, reminding her that beyond the wedding night, beyond the adjustment of new intimacy, lay a lifetime of shared days and nights, a marriage built on friendship and respect. When she returned to the main room, Patrick was seated on the sofa, gazing into the fire. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening. "Come sit with me," he invited, patting the space beside him. Abigail joined him on the sofa, close enough that their shoulders touched. For a while, they simply watched the flames together, content in each other's company. "I never thought I'd marry," Patrick said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence. "After my mother died and my father remarried, I saw how quickly love could turn to indifference, even cruelty. I decided I was better off alone." Abigail nodded, understanding all too well. "After my mother died and my father changed, I feared all marriages might be like theirs, unequal, with one person holding all the power and the other merely enduring." Patrick turned to face her more directly. "That's not what I want for us, Abigail. I want partnership, equality. I want your voice to be heard in all decisions that affect our life together." "And I want that too," she replied, reaching for his hand. "I believe we can build something different, something better than what either of us witnessed." Patrick lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "I vow to try, every day of our life together." The tenderness of the gesture, the sincerity in his eyes, dispelled the last of Abigail's nervousness. When Patrick stood and offered his hand, she took it without hesitation, following him to their bedroom. Later, as moonlight streamed through the window, casting silver patterns across the rumpled bedding, Abigail lay in the circle of her husband's arms, her head resting on his chest. The steady beat of his heart beneath her ear was a comforting rhythm, a promise of constancy in a world that had often proved uncertain. "Are you all right?" Patrick murmured, his fingers gently combing through her unbound hair. "More than all right," she assured him, pressing a kiss to his chest. "I'm happy, Patrick, truly happy." His arms tightened around her, and she felt him press a kiss to the top of her head. "As am I, wife, as am I." In that moment, with the Wyoming night stretching vast and star-filled beyond their window, Abigail knew she had found not just safety but belonging. The journey that had begun with a desperate flight from her father's farm had led her here, to this man, this home, this life of possibility. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The winter of 1876-1877 proved to be one of the harshest in Wyoming's history. Snow fell early and often, blanketing the ranch in deep drifts that isolated them from town for weeks at a time. Yet inside their snug cabin, Abigail and Patrick found warmth in each other's company, their marriage deepening through the long evenings spent before the fire, talking, reading aloud, or simply enjoying comfortable silence together. Abigail took to ranch life with a determination that impressed even Thomas, Patrick's experienced foreman. She learned to make soap and candles, to preserve meat and vegetables for the winter months, to tend the small flock of chickens that provided eggs even in the coldest weather. When one of the cows developed an infection after calving, it was Abigail who stayed up through the night, applying warm compresses and administering the medicine Patrick had on hand. "You've got a natural way with the animals," Thomas commented after the cow recovered. "Most city folks take longer to adjust." "I'm hardly city folk," Abigail reminded him with a smile. "I grew up on a farm, remember, though we never had cattle, just crops and a few pigs and chickens." As winter slowly loosened its grip on the land, signs of spring emerged, the first green shoots pushing through the melting snow, the return of birds from their southern migration, the lengthening of days. With the improved weather came the opportunity to travel to town again, and Abigail was eager to resume her position at the bank, as she and Patrick had agreed before their marriage. "Are you sure about this?" Patrick asked as they prepared for their first trip to Whispering Creek since their wedding day. "The ranch keeps you busy enough. You don't need to work for wages." "It's not about the money," Abigail explained as she packed the butter and eggs they would sell in town. "I enjoy the work, and Mr. Hargrove values my skills. Besides, I'd like to keep one foot in town life. It's good to have connections beyond the ranch." Patrick nodded, understanding in his eyes. "You're right, of course. I just worry about the long ride twice a week." They had worked out an arrangement with Mr. Hargrove for Abigail to work 3 days a week, Monday through Wednesday, staying at Widow Parker's on the intervening nights, before returning to the ranch on Wednesday evening. It wasn't ideal, but it allowed Abigail to maintain her independence while still being primarily at the ranch. That first return to town was a joyful reunion with friends who had missed them during the isolated winter months. Amanda had news of her engagement to the railroad station master. Sarah had been promoted to manager of the millinery shop, and Widow Parker had added 2 rooms to her boarding house to accommodate the town's growing population. "And what of my father?" Abigail asked Sheriff Wilson when they encountered him on Main Street. "Has there been any sign of him?" The sheriff shook his head. "Not in Whispering Creek. Word is he sold the farm and headed farther west, California, some say. Seems he decided to make a fresh start." The news brought Abigail a complex mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that the threat of her father's interference had passed. Sadness that their relationship had deteriorated beyond repair. Despite everything, he was still her father, the man who had once bounced her on his knee and taught her to fish in the creek that bordered their farm. "Are you all right?" Patrick asked gently as they walked away from the sheriff. Abigail nodded, blinking back unexpected tears. "Yes, it's just final somehow, knowing he's gone for good." Patrick's arm around her shoulders was a comfort as they continued down the street. "Family is complicated," he said simply, understanding in his voice. That evening, as they prepared to part, Patrick returning to the ranch, while Abigail remained at Widow Parker's for her 2 days of work, a strange reluctance overcame them both. "It's only 2 nights," Abigail said with forced cheerfulness as they stood outside the boarding house. "We've been apart longer when you've had to ride out to check the far pastures." "True," Patrick agreed, though his expression remained troubled. But that was different somehow. Abigail understood what he meant. There was something unsettling about voluntarily separating, about choosing to sleep apart when they had grown so accustomed to sharing a bed, to the comfort of each other's presence through the night. "I'll be home before you know it," she promised, rising on tiptoe to kiss him goodbye. Patrick's arms tightened around her waist, his kiss deeper and more possessive than usual. When they finally parted, his blue eyes were dark with an emotion Abigail had come to recognize well over the winter months. "I'll be counting the hours," he said, his voice rough. The arrangement worked well through the spring and into the summer. Abigail found satisfaction in maintaining her position at the bank, in contributing to their household income, and in keeping her connections in town. Patrick, though he missed her during her absences, supported her independence, proud of her abilities and her determination to use them. It was late August when Abigail first suspected that their lives were about to change again. The persistent nausea in the mornings, the unusual fatigue, the strange cravings for foods she normally didn't favor all pointed to one conclusion, confirmed by a discreet visit to the town doctor during one of her stays in Whispering Creek. She waited until she was certain before sharing the news with Patrick. On a warm September evening, almost a year after their wedding, they sat together on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. "I have something to tell you," Abigail said, her voice quiet but steady. Patrick turned to her, curiosity in his eyes. "What is it?" "We're going to have a baby," she said simply. "In early spring, Dr. Mitchell thinks." For a moment Patrick seemed frozen, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, a smile spread across his face, transforming it with joy. "A baby," he repeated, as if testing the word. "We're going to be parents." Abigail nodded, relief flooding through her at his obvious happiness. "Yes, are you pleased?" In answer, Patrick gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious porcelain. "Please doesn't begin to describe it," he murmured against her hair. "I'm overwhelmed, Abigail, overwhelmed with gratitude and joy and love. Love." The word they had danced around for months, feeling it grow between them but rarely giving it voice, as if naming it might somehow diminish its power. Now it hung in the air between them, undeniable and perfect. "I love you," Abigail said, the words coming easily now that he had opened the door. "I love you, Patrick Callahan." His kiss was tender, reverent almost, his hands cradling her face as if she were the most valuable treasure he had ever held. "And I love you, Abigail Callahan, more than I ever thought possible." The pregnancy brought changes to their routine. By mutual agreement, Abigail reduced her time at the bank to 1 day a week, with Patrick accompanying her to town and remaining there during her workday rather than leaving her alone. As her belly grew, so did Patrick's protectiveness, though he was careful never to smother her independence. Winter returned, less severe than the previous year but still challenging. The isolation of the ranch during snowstorms no longer bothered Abigail as it once might have. Indeed, she found contentment in the cocoon of their home, in the preparations for the baby's arrival, in the deepening bonds of their marriage. Patrick devoted his spare time to crafting a cradle from pine harvested on their land, carving delicate patterns of leaves and stars into the headboard. Abigail sewed tiny garments from soft flannel, lined a basket with quilted padding for the baby's first bed, and knitted blankets in anticipation of chilly spring nights. They speculated endlessly about the child, whether it would be a boy or girl, whose features it might inherit, what name they would choose. "If it's a girl," Patrick said one evening as they sat before the fire, his hand resting on Abigail's rounded belly, "I'd like to name her after your mother." "What was her name?" "Mary," Abigail replied, touched by the suggestion. "Mary Elizabeth." Patrick nodded approvingly. "A beautiful name, and if it's a boy," Abigail considered for a moment. "Perhaps James, after my grandfather. He was a kind man, always gentle with me when I was small." "James Patrick," he suggested, a hint of pride in his voice at the thought of passing on his name. James Patrick Callahan, Abigail agreed, placing her hand over his where it rested on their unborn child. It's perfect. The baby arrived on a clear April morning in 1878, after a night of labor during which Patrick proved himself the most steadfast of partners, never leaving Abigail's side despite the midwife's suggestions that he might be more comfortable waiting elsewhere. "My place is here," he had insisted, holding Abigail's hand through each contraction, wiping her brow with a cool cloth, murmuring encouragement when her strength seemed to flag. As dawn broke over the eastern hills, their daughter entered the world with a lusty cry that spoke of healthy lungs and a strong will. "She's beautiful," the midwife declared, placing the swaddled infant in Abigail's arms after cleaning and examining her. "Perfect in every way." Abigail gazed down at the tiny face, overwhelmed by a love so intense it nearly took her breath away. The baby had a dusting of copper hair, so like her own, and when she blinked up at her mother, Abigail saw that her eyes were the deep blue of newborns but with a shape that promised they would resemble Patrick's. "Mary Elizabeth," she whispered, touching a finger to the impossibly soft cheek. "Welcome to the world, little one." Patrick sat on the edge of the bed, his arm around Abigail's shoulders, his expression one of wonder as he beheld his daughter. "She's miraculous," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "just like her mother." The early months of parenthood brought challenges, sleepless nights, the demands of a growing infant, the adjustment to new routines, but also a deepening of the bond between Abigail and Patrick as they navigated this new territory together. Patrick proved to be as devoted a father as he was a husband, never hesitating to take his turn walking the floor with a fussy baby or changing soiled linens. By the time Mary was 6 months old, a new rhythm had established itself in their household. Abigail had temporarily set aside her work at the bank, finding that the ranch and the baby occupied all her time and energy. Yet rather than feeling confined by this change, she discovered a fulfillment in motherhood that complemented the satisfaction she had found in marriage. "Do you miss the bank?" Patrick asked one evening as they sat on the porch, Mary sleeping contentedly in his arms while the sunset painted the sky. Abigail considered the question honestly. "Sometimes," she admitted. "I miss using that part of my mind, the satisfaction of balancing the ledgers perfectly. But this time with Mary is precious and fleeting. The bank will still be there when she's older." Patrick nodded, understanding in his eyes. "And you'll go back when you're ready. Or perhaps find some other way to use your talents." His casual assumption that her abilities and ambitions remained important, even as they adjusted to parenthood, was one of the many reasons Abigail's love for him continued to deepen. As Mary grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered under their joint stewardship. Patrick's careful breeding program improved their cattle herd, while Abigail's garden expanded to provide not only for their household, but enough surplus to sell in town. They added a room to the cabin, built a proper chicken coop, and fenced in a larger kitchen garden to protect it from wandering livestock. In the spring of 1880, when Mary was 2 years old and thoroughly enjoying her role as helper to both parents, Abigail discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the news was received with unalloyed joy by both parents and, after careful explanation, with excited if limited understanding by their daughter. "Baby in there?" Mary would ask, patting Abigail's growing belly with gentle hands. "Baby come out soon?" "Not for a while yet, sweetheart," Abigail would explain patiently. "The baby needs time to grow strong like you did." The second pregnancy proceeded smoothly until early November, when Abigail woke in the night with sharp pains that she knew were not normal. Patrick rode through the darkness to fetch the midwife, his face tight with fear, But by the time they returned, Abigail had already lost the baby, a boy, tiny and perfectly formed but too small to survive outside the womb. The grief that followed was profound, a shadow that dimmed the light in their home for many weeks. Patrick mourned deeply but privately, throwing himself into ranch work during the day and holding Abigail close at night, offering comfort even as he sought it. Abigail's grief was more open, expressed in tears that sometimes seemed to have no end, in periods of quietness that worried those who loved her. It was Mary, in the innocent wisdom of childhood, who began to draw Abigail back from the depths of her sorrow. The little girl's need for her mother's attention and care, her simple joy in everyday wonders, her unwavering love all served as anchors to the present, reminders that life continued and held beauty, even amid loss. By spring, the sharpest edges of grief had softened, leaving behind a tender spot in both their hearts but no longer overshadowing their lives. And when summer came, bringing with it the news of another pregnancy, they received it with cautious hope, tempered by the knowledge of what could be lost. This time, they told no one outside their household until Abigail was well into her 6th month, and the pregnancy appeared to be progressing normally. Even Mary was not included in the secret until her mother's changing shape made explanation necessary. In February of 1881, James Patrick Callahan arrived safely, a robust boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's determined chin. His birth healed something in both his parents, a wound that had been slowly mending but needed the balm of new life to fully close. "He's perfect," Patrick whispered as he held his son for the first time, wonder and gratitude mingling in his voice. "Absolutely perfect." Abigail, exhausted but radiant, watched her husband and son with tears of joy in her eyes. "Yes," she agreed, "he is." The years that followed brought both challenges and blessings. The ranch expanded as Patrick acquired additional land from a neighbor returning east. Abigail eventually resumed work at the bank, though only one day a week, bringing the children with her to town and using the opportunity to maintain their connections to the community. Mary grew into a thoughtful, intelligent girl with her mother's facility for numbers and her father's love of the land. James, 2 years her junior, was more rambunctious, a natural horseman from the time he could sit upright, with a laugh that could dispel the darkest mood. When Abigail was 30 and Patrick 40, their family was completed by the arrival of twins, a boy and girl named Thomas and Elizabeth, born in the spring of 1886. The double blessing brought double work, of course, but also double joy, and the older children proved eager helpers in caring for their younger siblings. On a warm evening in late September of 1886, 10 years after Abigail had fled her father's farm and found herself riding beside a kind-eyed cowboy, the Callahan family gathered on the porch of their expanded cabin to watch the sunset. Mary, now 8, sat with a book in her lap, occasionally reading passages aloud to 6-year-old James, who was whittling a small piece of wood under his father's supervision. The twins, just 6 months old, were already asleep inside, their soft breathing monitored by the open window behind the family. 10 years, Patrick mused, his arm around Abigail's shoulders as they sat side by side on the porch swing. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I saw you racing across the prairie, and sometimes it feels like I've known you all my life." Abigail leaned into his embrace, content in a way she had never imagined possible when she'd made her desperate escape a decade earlier. "The best decision I ever made was leaving that farm," she said softly. "And the best luck I ever had was you riding beside me all the way to town." Patrick pressed a kiss to her temple, his touch as tender now as it had been in the early days of their marriage. Not luck, he corrected gently. Providence. Some things are meant to be, Abigail. Some people are meant to find each other, no matter what obstacles stand in their way. As the last rays of sunlight gilded the distant mountains, Abigail reflected on the journey that had brought her here, from a frightened young woman fleeing abuse to a confident wife, mother, and partner in the thriving ranch she and Patrick had built together. The path had not always been smooth, but every step, even the painful ones, had led to this moment, this family, this love. Meant to be, she agreed, turning her face up to his for a kiss that still held the power to make her heart race after all these years. Absolutely meant to be. In the gathering dusk, with the Wyoming sky stretching endless and star-filled above them, the Callahan family remained on their porch, bound together by love and choice, and the beautiful life they had created, a life that had begun on that fateful day, when a young woman had been chased from her father's farm, and a cowboy had ridden beside her all the way to town.